Hey team! Alright, so our last lecture in chapter 34 on the vertebrates, so we are going to jump into the mammals. And just a note for this class, this semester we are not going to be talking about the primates. So the end of chapter 34 talks about human evolution and the specifics of primates. We are not going to be jumping into that. Okay. Alright, so mammals. Mammals are those amniotes, those synapsids. They arose Permian period. Okay, so these are still amniotes, still tetrapods, still vertebrates, but instead of the other clade, the diaspids, this is part of the synapsids clade, okay, of amniotes. But what makes them unique is they are amniotes that produce hair made out of keratin, so it's going to be homologous to the reptile scales or the feathers of a bird. Same basic structure, it's just being tinkered with for a different function now. And that hair is significant because it helps to provide insulation against extreme conditions. So against extreme heat or extreme cold, hair provides an insulative layer. They also are unique in the sense that they produce milk, and this is where their name of this group comes from, is mammal, from the mammary glands that produce milk that allows them to nourish their young. So the first mammals were around during the time of the dinosaurs. They were probably small, they were likely insect eaters, and they were usually nocturnal. Okay. And then after the dinosaurs went extinct, and after they started to decline greatly, the climate cooled significantly, and we start to see this transition of mammals after the extinction of dinosaurs and after that change in climate, where they start to become more active during the day. Okay, and there's a few reasons for this. We touched on this when we talked about adaptive radiation. So after the dinosaurs went extinct, there were a whole bunch of new niches available for them to utilize, a whole bunch of new resources available. So the dinosaurs had been occupying most of the resources during the day, and they would have potentially hunted the mammals or even competed with the mammals for those resources. So mammals tended to be around at night, to be awake at night when the dinosaurs were around. Okay. Also, so after the dinosaurs went extinct, they could now exploit those resources during the day. The other thing too is that after the climate cooled, mammals are endothermic like birds, and so they can withstand that cooler temperature. They can use their own body metabolism to maintain their internal body heat. Okay, so that allows them to exist in cooler climates where we wouldn't find more typical ectothermic animals like the reptiles. Okay. So they went through massive adaptive radiation after the downfall of the dinosaurs. And so let's talk about some other traits of mammals. All right. So we're going to talk about how mammals have hair and how they have mammary glands. Okay, again, that hair is to help provide insulation. And an additional feature besides that hair is that all mammals have a layer of subcutaneous fat. So just under our skin, there's a layer of fat that basically is covering our entire body. And that provides an additional layer. Fat's pretty good at insulating. So fat provides an additional layer of insulation to help minimize any sort of loss of that heat that we're using our metabolism to maintain, minimize the loss of that heat to the environment. Okay, so it's an energy efficiency thing. Because we are endothermic, we use our metabolism to maintain our body heat, we have a really high caloric need, and because of that high caloric need, we have a high need for oxygen and for waste disposal. And so because of that high need of oxygen, and we produce a lot of waste, metabolic waste, kidneys are something that are unique to mammals. At least the structure of the nephron that we find in mammals, that is just something that is unique, just the juxtamedullary nephron, which we'll talk about later. And then also we have an incredibly efficient respiratory and circulatory system. Our four-chambered heart is very efficient at moving our blood around so that we can exchange gases and remove waste from our cells and from our tissues. And then tied into that increase in efficiency in respiration, mammals now have a layer that sits just under their rib cage, or just under their lungs and their rib cage, the diaphragm. right? Which you've experienced if you ever have hiccups. When you just a hiccup, that's your diaphragm basically spasming and we can't control it. But what that muscle is, that diaphragm, it's a muscle that we pull down when we breathe in. And as we pull that muscle down, that creates a negative pressure, a lower air pressure in our lungs, which causes air to rush in. Okay, so that diaphragm, that extra muscle that we have in mammals, that helps to increase the efficiency of respiration. Mammals also tend to have larger brains compared to reptiles. We think that being endothermic, because we have such a higher caloric need, this larger brain helps us to gain those calories, those extra calories that we need. And then tied into that also comes complex social behaviors and other things like that, and the ability to learn in ways that we don't see in other groups. So that brain, though, requires a lot of energy, and it requires a very long time for development. And so in order to provide enough food for their young, those mammary glands that are producing milk, that enables the elongated or longer duration of parental care that we see in mammals, that we don't necessarily see in other organisms, especially not the reptiles or amphibians. So mammals are notorious for having very long time periods in which the young are being taken care of by the parents. And we also see some other mammalian traits, or the differentiation of teeth. So in reptiles have what's called homodont teeth. So homo meaning the same and dont meaning teeth, right? So all of their teeth are the same shape. They're usually conical in shape. There's no differentiation in the structure of their teeth. Versus in mammals have heterodont teeth, like we can see here or up here, right? So we have these incisors or these canines, and then the molars. They're all shaped differently for different purposes, right? Incisors are really good for snipping off food, like biting off blades of grass. Canines are really good for piercing. Premolars are good for tearing, and molars are good for shearing. And then those different shapes of those teeth, those heterodont teeth, are going to be different depending on the diet of that mammal, depending on if it's an herbivore versus a carnivore versus an omnivore, right? So we are omnivores, so our teeth take on a little bit of every shape. Versus this lynx right here, it's very much a carnivore, and so its molars are going to be sharper, more pointed. Its canines are going to be more extenuated. They're going to be longer, accented. And its incisors are going to be very small and not necessarily as prevalent as we would see in something like a rabbit or a rodent or something like that. Okay. And tied into this idea, we're still looking at the mouth, right? If we look at this image right here, this is a reptile jaw. Okay, so we have all these extra bones right here. So the angular, the squamosal, and the articular bone. In mammals, there's really only one jawbone, the mandible. Okay, so there's this one single jawbone that we have, that is the mandible, that is unique to the mammalians. These other bones that are present in the reptile jaw, these have now been co-opted, and they've changed their function. Their function is now to create the Inca malleus and stapes that we see in the inner ear that help to transmit sound waves to our eardrum. Okay. So mammals also are typically terrestrial, though there are some that are marine, but that's a secondary adaptation. So we divide mammals up into three major groups: the monotremes, marsupials, and the eutherians, or also called the placentals. So the monotremes, like this little guy right here, this is echidna, this is so cute. The monotremes, they're considered the basal mammal group. They're the most ancient mammals. They still lay eggs, but they do produce milk. So they lay eggs. They typically keep the eggs in a sort of pouch-like structure. And so these, the platypus and the two species of echidna, we only find them in Australia and New Guinea. They're only limited to those ranges. They tend to have very low body temperatures, and their overall basal metabolism is very low compared to other mammals. They produce milk to feed their young once their young hatch from eggs, but they don't produce that milk from a nipple. It basically just exudes out of the mother's stomach area, and then the young will kind of lick up that milk from the mother's fur. Okay. So these are the mammals that still are laying eggs. They don't have internal placenta yet in this group. Okay. And so their young, when they're born, are very, very immature, and they spend a lot of time hanging out in mom's pouch, lapping up that milk. Okay, but they use eggs, and that's going to be different than the marsupials. The marsupials are the pouched mammals, so things like possums, kangaroos, koalas. These used to be very broadly distributed, but now they're typically only found in North and South America and Australia. In these marsupials, the marsupials, when they reproduce, their embryos don't spend much time in that placenta developing, and they aren't much more developed than this newborn right here in this kangaroo. When they basically are leave the vagina and leave the uterus and then climb up into the pouch, and once they're up into the pouch, they find a nipple and they spend the next few months developing. And then the last group, the eutherians, these are the placental mammals. So these mammals do not lay eggs and they do not have pouches. The young are typically much more well developed once they are born. And their placentas have more layers to them and extra layers, more complexity than we see in the marsupials. So this extra embryonic membranes of that amniotic egg are now basically turned into those placental layers. And so they spend a longer time in the uterus, which allows for a greater transfer of nutrients from mom to baby. So that way the young is better developed when they're born. So that way they can be more autonomous, more individual, if you will. But why would mammals want to, why would there be a selective pressure to internalize that amniotic egg? Well, there's a few reasons. One could be it's easier for the mother to move around. She doesn't have to go back, or even the parents don't have to go back to one single nest to wait for those individuals to hatch, for the young to hatch. And also, as long as mom is safe, baby is safe for the most part too, right? So it creates a more mobile type of reproduction, and it allows for longer. It also allows for a longer period of development for the embryo because they're being retained inside of the mother. Okay, so that way the young are more developed when they're born, for the most part, than compared to a reptile or a bird. So we are eutherians. We would be part of this eutherian clade. We're not going to talk about the primate evolution, but typically for most eutherians, they're once they're born, they're good to go. They're ready to jump up and run around within a few hours a lot of times, with the exception of humans. And part of the reason why is because of our big brains, because we have really large heads. Those large heads are harder to get through the birth canal, and so we've basically traded off the ability to be self-sufficient when we're born for having large heads, large brains, more intelligence that allows us to carry out more complex behaviors. All right, so that is the overview of mammals, and that brings us to the end of what we're going to cover for chapter 34. Yay, good job.